Hey folks, I know I am just an old guy telling stories, but please leave a like and subscribe before we start. Let's enjoy in today's stories. Before I dive into today's stories, I want to say, disclaimer. The content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. I've always had this weird fascination with the obscure corners of the internet. I'm not talking about TikTok rabbit holes or endless Reddit threads about unsolved mysteries. I mean the dark web, where you stumble across things that feel like they shouldn't exist. I've never been into anything illegal, to be clear, but I've always been curious about the stuff that people say is hidden there. Mysterious services, creepy auctions, or forums with users who seem to live in a world completely disconnected from the one we know. A few weeks ago, while I was poking around using the TOR browser, don't judge me, I came across a post on an Onion forum that caught my eye. It was titled, "Exclusive Stay at Abandoned Mountain Lodge, Winter Special." The post was written in surprisingly decent English compared to the cryptic garbage that's usually out there. It promised a rare and thrilling experience at an isolated ski lodge high up in the mountains of Colorado. The poster claimed the lodge had been abandoned for decades and was now considered a hotspot for the paranormal. For some reason, they were offering it up for rental. The price was suspiciously low, but what really got me was the line at the end. "This is not for the faint of heart. The children like to play games." I should have closed the tab and gone back to watching stupid YouTube videos, but my curiosity, and maybe boredom, got the better of me. I'm not some ghost hunter or thrill seeker, but I've always loved the idea of staying somewhere off the grid. Plus, the idea of a haunted ski lodge, it sounded like a fun story to tell later. So, like an idiot, I clicked the link. The site it brought me to was super basic, just a black background with some grainy photos of the lodge. The building looked eerie. It was a massive log cabin, the kind you'd imagine rich people vacationing in during the 80s. But these photos showed it in disrepair. Windows cracked or boarded up, snow piling high on the roof, the surrounding forest swallowing the place whole. There was no location listed, just instructions to pay via Bitcoin and wait for an email with the details. I should have backed out right there, but I didn't. Maybe it was the thought of getting some cool Instagram shots or just the appeal of doing something completely out of the ordinary. But I went through with it. I sent the Bitcoin, about $150 worth, and waited. The email came about an hour later. It gave me coordinates and some additional details. Bring your own supplies, food, water, sleeping gear. No cell service in the area. Do not leave the property after dark. Avoid the east wing of the lodge. The whole thing felt off, but I rationalized it. Maybe the haunted thing was just a gimmick to get weirdos like me to rent it. It was probably some old Airbnb scam that no one would actually fall for, but I was too intrigued to let it go. I packed up my gear, borrowed some snow chains for my tires, and set off early the next morning. The drive took me way longer than I expected. The roads got narrower and icier as I climbed higher into the mountains. After a few hours, I reached the end of what my GPS could handle. From there, I had to follow the coordinates manually. I passed through this tiny town that felt like it hadn't been updated since 1975. No Starbucks, no McDonald's, just a single gas station and a diner that looked like something out of a Stephen King novel. I stopped to grab some coffee, and the guy behind the counter gave me a weird look when I asked about the area. "Not many people head up that way," he said, handing me a styrofoam cup. His voice had that gravelly tone that made you second-guess your decisions. I brushed it off and kept driving. About an hour later, I found myself on a barely there dirt road that twisted and turned through a dense forest. My car's heater was struggling to keep up, and the sun was already starting to dip below the horizon. Finally, I saw it, the lodge. It looked just like the pictures, but somehow worse. The place felt massive but suffocating at the same time. The logs were dark and rotting, and the snow-covered roof sagged in places. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying in the wind like it was waiting for me. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack, and hesitated for just a second before heading inside. The air was freezing, even colder than it should have been. Inside, it was like stepping into a time capsule. The furniture was covered in dusty sheets, and old ski equipment was scattered around like someone had just walked out one day and never returned. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, but there was no firewood to be seen. I explored a bit, shining my flashlight into the dark corners. There were family photos still hanging on the walls, but the faces were faded and warped, as if the photos had melted in the heat before freezing over again. The place was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden floors under my boots. I started setting up my sleeping area in what looked like the main lounge. That's when I noticed something strange. Carved into the wooden beams above the fireplace were a series of words in what looked like Latin. I don't know much about languages, but I recognized a couple of them from the few years of Spanish I took in high school. Words like infantes and ludere, kids, play. I shrugged it off as some weird decoration or maybe graffiti from whoever stayed here last. But it did make me think about the last line of the ad. The children like to play games. That night, as I tried to fall asleep, I swear I heard faint laughter. High-pitched, like children giggling. It could have been the wind, I told myself. But it wasn't just outside. It felt like it was coming from somewhere deep within the lodge. I didn't sleep much, but the next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. Just the creaking of an old building and my mind playing tricks on me. But as I explored more of the lodge, I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. At the end of the main hallway, just before the east wing, the one they told me to avoid, there was a small pair of shoes. They were covered in dust but perfectly placed side by side like someone had just taken them off. That's when I started noticing the whispers. The whispers started faint, almost like background noise. At first, I thought it might be the wind cutting through the cracks in the old wooden structure, or maybe even the snow brushing against the windows. But as I walked further down the hall, it became clear the sound wasn't random, it was distinct. Words, soft, quick, and layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once. I stopped in front of the east wing, the part of the lodge the instructions had specifically warned me about. The door was shut, with a rusty chain wrapped loosely around the handles. It didn't look like much of a barrier, though. I could have easily pulled it open if I wanted to, but I didn't. Something about the air in that spot felt heavier, like stepping into a room where someone had just been arguing. I leaned closer, trying to make out what the whispers were saying. I don't know Latin, but a few words stood out. Ones I'd seen on the carved beams in the lounge the night before. Ludere came up again. Play. I shook it off and backed away. I told myself it was just an old building creaking and echoing, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. To distract myself, I decided to check out the rest of the lodge. There was plenty to explore, and the morning sunlight streaming through the cracked windows made the place feel less eerie. Almost peaceful in a weird way. I found what looked like a kitchen, with a rusted-out stove and a fridge that hadn't been cleaned in decades. There was even a small dining room next to it, with a long wooden table still set for dinner. Plates and silverware were neatly arranged, though they were covered in a thick layer of dust. What caught my attention, though, were the chairs. They were all normal, except for one at the very end. It was a child's chair, a tiny thing, painted white, with little carvings of animals along the edges. I walked over to it, brushing some of the dust off with my sleeve. Something about it felt out of place. Why would a kid's chair be here? The rest of the lodge was clearly designed for adults with its heavy furniture and rugged decor. I stared at it for a moment before deciding to move on. That's when I noticed the window. It faced out into the forest, giving a perfect view of the snow-covered trees that stretched endlessly into the horizon. But what made me stop was the handprint. A small child-sized handprint smudged in the frost on the glass. It was fresh. I froze, staring at it, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe I had brushed against the glass without realizing it. But no. My hands were much bigger, and besides, I hadn't gone anywhere near the windows. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't going to let my mind run wild over something that could easily be explained. So I grabbed my phone to take a picture. Not because I was scared, but because I thought it'd be fun to share later, proof of how creepy the place was. But my phone wouldn't turn on. I know I charged it before I left. I even brought a power bank just in case. But when I pressed the power button, nothing happened. It was completely dead. Annoyed, I shoved it back into my pocket and decided to head back to the lounge to eat something. On the way, I passed by the staircase leading to the second floor. I hadn't been up there yet, mostly because the stairs looked like they'd collapse if I even tried. But as I passed, I heard it again. The giggling. This time, it was unmistakable. It came from upstairs. I froze, staring up at the landing. The hallway above was shrouded in shadows, and the banister was missing in places, like someone had ripped chunks of it out. The giggling was soft, like it was coming from the far end of the upstairs hall. "Hello?" I called out before I could stop myself. My voice echoed through the lodge, but there was no response. The giggling stopped, replaced by a silence so complete that it almost hurt my ears. I don't know why, but I decided to go up. Maybe it was because I was already here and I didn't want to chicken out. Or maybe it was because some part of me felt like I had to know what was going on. I climbed the stairs slowly, testing each step to make sure it wouldn't break under my weight. The upstairs was even colder than the rest of the lodge. The floor was covered in snow that had blown in through broken windows, and the air smelled stale, like wet wood. There were a few doors on either side of the hallway, all slightly ajar. I peeked into the first one and found an old bedroom. The bed was still made, though the blankets were moth-eaten and discolored. A small dresser sat in the corner, with a mirror hanging above it. I was about to move on when I noticed something in the mirror, not a reflection but a word. It was written in the dust that coated the glass, faint but visible. Ludere. I stared at it for a moment before wiping it away with my sleeve. The mirror squeaked under my hand, but as soon as the word was gone, I heard something behind me. It wasn't a giggle this time. It was a single word, spoken softly but clearly. Ludere. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I hurried back downstairs, grabbed my backpack, and decided to spend the rest of the day outside. The lodge was creepy, sure, but it was probably just my mind messing with me. I needed fresh air, sunlight, and a break from the silence of the place. As I stepped out into the snow, I glanced back at the lodge. For a moment I thought I saw something move in one of the windows on the second floor, a shadow, small and quick, like a child darting out of view. But when I looked again, it was gone. I spent the rest of the day walking around the property, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing it. But as the sun started to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the day outside pacing the property and trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The lodge, with its boarded windows and decaying structure, loomed behind me like a silent observer. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the air was so crisp it almost burned to breathe. I told myself I'd stick it out just one more night. After all, I'd paid for this, and as creepy as things had been, nothing truly unexplainable had happened. At least that's what I kept repeating in my head. As the sun dipped lower, I reluctantly headed back inside. The light had softened, casting long golden beams through the broken windows. It almost made the place look warm, cozy even. I decided to make the most of the daylight while it lasted, so I started exploring again, this time more carefully. That's when I found the study. It was tucked away in the back of the lodge, behind a heavy oak door that was slightly warped from years of neglect. Inside, the air smelled different, stale but sharp like old paper and dried wood. The walls were lined with tall, built-in bookshelves, most of them empty. A large desk sat in the center of the room, with a leather chair tipped over behind it. The window at the far end was cracked, letting in a faint breeze that stirred the dust in the air. I walked over to the desk, running my fingers over its scratched surface. A stack of yellowed papers sat in the corner, along with an old oil lamp that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But what really caught my attention was the book. It was massive, bound in cracked brown leather, with no title or markings on the cover. The edges were frayed and the corners looked like they'd been chewed by mice. It seemed out of place, considering how most of the shelves were bare. I picked it up carefully, surprised by how heavy it was, and set it on the desk. When I opened it, the spine creaked like it was protesting, and a faint puff of dust escaped into the air. The pages were thick, almost like parchment, covered in handwritten text that was barely legible. Most of it was in a language I didn't recognize. Latin, I guessed, based on the style of the lettering. But some sections had been translated into English, written in a neat flowing script that contrasted sharply with the roughness of the rest of the book. The title of the section was what made my stomach drop: The Night Walkers. I'm not a superstitious person, but something about the name sent a chill through me. The text went on to describe them as shadowy figures that wandered the mountains at night, drawn to places where children's laughter once echoed. They weren't ghosts, the book emphasized. They were something else entirely, something ancient. The text was written in a formal, almost poetic tone, but the message was clear. The Nightwalkers weren't to be taken lightly. According to the book, they didn't harm people outright, but encountering one was considered a bad omen. It described them as silent, unnaturally still, and almost human-like in appearance, but not quite. Their movements were said to be jerky, like puppets on strings, and they always came in pairs or groups. What really stuck with me, though, was the warning written in bold letters near the bottom of the page. If you see one, do not move, do not speak, do not react. To acknowledge their presence is to invite them closer. I stared at the words for what felt like forever, my heart pounding in my chest. The book didn't explain what would happen if they got closer, but the emphasis on the warning was enough to unsettle me. I flipped through the rest of the pages, but most of it was unreadable, either too faded or written in the original Latin. I closed the book and sat back in the chair, suddenly hyper-aware of how quiet the lodge had become. The sun was almost gone now, and the dim light filtering through the window made the room feel smaller. I glanced at the door, half expecting to hear the giggling again, but all I heard was the faint creak of the wood as the building settled. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then and there, but I reminded myself that I'd made it through the first night just fine. Besides, the book was probably just some elaborate hoax like the rest of this place. Whoever owned the lodge must have left it behind as part of the haunted experience they were selling. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as I carried the book back to the lounge with me. I didn't want to leave it in the study, but I didn't want to read any more of it either. I set it down on the coffee table and turned on the small lantern I'd brought with me, trying to create some sense of normalcy. The night dragged on, and I found myself constantly glancing at the windows and the shadows they cast on the walls. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker, like something darting past the edge of my vision. But when I looked directly, there was nothing there. I'd decided to call it a night early, hoping sleep would come easier than it had the night before. I unrolled my sleeping bag in front of the fireplace and turned off the lantern, plunging the room into darkness. But sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words from the book. Do not move. Do not speak. Do not react. They repeated in my head like a mantra, refusing to let me rest. And then, just as I was finally starting to drift off, I heard it. Not laughter this time, but footsteps, soft, deliberate, and close. I kept my eyes shut, my breathing steady, my body frozen. I don't know why I thought it would help, but the warning from the book was the only thing I could focus on. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away from where I lay. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't dare open my eyes, and in the silence that followed, I could have sworn I felt the faintest brush of cold air against my face. like something was leaning over me, watching, waiting. I don't know how long I lay there, completely still, counting the seconds in my head. The air in the room felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, but I refused to move. The warning from the book was burned into my mind, and I clung to it like a lifeline. The footsteps didn't return, but the silence somehow felt worse. I could hear the faint creaks of the lodge settling, the occasional rush of wind against the walls, and what sounded like soft shuffling, like someone dragging their feet across the wooden floor. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I thought it was safe to open my eyes, something inside me told me not to. Eventually, the faint blue light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the windows, and with it came the courage to finally sit up. The room was empty. The old book still sat on the coffee table, exactly where I'd left it. But something about the room felt different. Office. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but then I noticed the tracks in the thin layer of dust on the floor. They weren't mine. The prints were small, like a child's, and they started near the fireplace before trailing off toward the hallway. They didn't make any sense. There were no wet spots from snow, no dirt, just faint impressions in the dust, as if someone had tiptoed through the room barefoot. I should have left right then and there. I even started packing my things, shoving them into my bag as fast as I could. But as I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I heard something fall behind me. I turned to see the book lying open on the floor, its pages spread wide. I froze, staring at it, trying to convince myself that I'd knocked it over somehow. But I was nowhere near the table when it fell. I walked over, cautiously, and picked it up. The page it had fallen open to was different this time, one I hadn't seen before. At the top of the page was a crude drawing of a mountain lodge, not unlike the one I was standing in. The details weren't exact, but it was close enough to make my stomach churn. Below the drawing was another warning written in the same neat English as the section on the Nightwalkers. Shadows that move on their own are not shadows. Do not follow them. I slammed the book shut and tossed it back onto the table. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just a coincidence, but deep down I knew better. Something was wrong with this place, and I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out what. The rest of the day was quiet. Too quiet. I stayed outside as much as possible, pacing the property and trying to distract myself with the view of the surrounding mountains. The snow was blinding in the sunlight, and for a while, it almost felt peaceful. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop glancing back at the lodge, half expecting to see movement in the windows. By late afternoon, the clouds began to roll in, and the temperature dropped sharply. I decided to head back inside before the weather turned worse. As much as I hated the thought of spending another night there, I knew it was too dangerous to try to leave after dark. When I stepped back into the lodge, the air felt colder than it should have been. My breath misted in front of me, and the floorboards groaned loudly under my boots. I decided to stick to the main lounge for the rest of the night. No exploring, no reading. I just wanted to keep the fire going and make it through until morning. As the hours dragged on, the storm outside grew louder. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and snow began to seep in through the cracks. I was sitting by the fireplace staring at the flames when I noticed something strange. The shadows on the walls were moving. At first I thought it was just the firelight flickering, casting strange shapes on the wood. But the longer I watched, the more I realized the shadows weren't matching the movements of the flames. They twisted and stretched unnaturally, almost like they had a mind of their own. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire instead. But then I saw it. One of the shadows broke away from the others. It slid across the wall, slow and deliberate, until it disappeared around the corner leading to the hallway. I didn't follow it. The warning from the book echoed in my head. Do not follow them. Instead, I stayed where I was, gripping the edge of my chair so tightly my knuckles ached. The fire crackled softly, but it didn't feel comforting anymore. It felt like a barrier, like the only thing keeping me safe. The hours passed slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. I didn't move from my spot, too afraid to even look away from the fire. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of dark shapes just beyond the edge of the firelight, but I refused to acknowledge them. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first rays of sunlight began to creep through the windows. The lodge was silent again, but the uneasy feeling lingered, heavy in the air. I didn't bother waiting to see if the shadows would return. As soon as there was enough light to see, I grabbed my bag, threw on my coat, and headed for the door. But just as I stepped outside, I heard it again, that faint, high-pitched giggling coming from somewhere deep inside the lodge. I didn't look back. By the time I reached my car, the sun was fully up, but the air still carried that biting cold that settled deep in my bones. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, not from the cold, but from everything I had experienced. I threw my backpack into the passenger seat, started the engine, and didn't even wait for it to warm up. I just wanted to get off that mountain as fast as possible. The narrow, icy road that had felt so exciting on the way up now felt like a trap. Every turn, every bend seemed endless. The trees loomed over me, their branches skeletal and bare against the pale sky. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, anything, following me. But there was nothing, just the empty, snow-covered road behind me. As I drove, I couldn't stop replaying the last 2 nights in my head. The whispers, the giggles, the shadows that moved on their own. It all felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. But the book, that was what stuck with me the most. Its warnings, its crude drawings, its impossible age. Who had written it? And why had it been left there, in that lodge, for someone like me to find? The storm from the night before had left the road slick, and I had to drive carefully to avoid sliding into the ditch. The trees thinned out as I descended the mountain, and soon the lodge was out of sight, swallowed by the forest. I should have felt relieved, but instead I felt uneasy, like I was leaving something unfinished. I passed the small town I'd driven through on my way in. It looked just as empty as it had before, the gas station's lone sign swinging in the wind. I considered stopping for coffee, but the thought of explaining where I'd been, or why I looked so rattled, made me decide against it. I just wanted to get back to civilization, back to normalcy. Hours later, I finally reached the main highway. The sight of other cars, of people going about their lives, brought a wave of relief I hadn't expected. It was over. Whatever I had experienced in that lodge was behind me now. But even as I drove further and further from the mountains, the unease didn't completely fade. I couldn't stop thinking about the details, the things I couldn't explain. The handprint on the window, the small footprints in the dust, the way the book seemed to know more about the lodge and its secrets than anyone else ever could. By the time I reached home, the sun was setting again, casting long shadows across the street. My apartment felt almost foreign to me, like I'd been gone for months instead of just a few days. I dropped my bag by the door, collapsed onto the couch, and stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours. For the first time in days, I felt safe. But that safety came with an unsettling realization. I had no idea what I'd just experienced, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. That night I unpacked my bag and found the small things I'd brought with me, extra batteries, snacks, my journal. But as I dug through it, I realized something was missing. My phone. I distinctly remembered putting it in my pocket the night I'd tried to take a picture of the handprint, but now it was nowhere to be found. I searched everywhere, my bag, the car, my coat, but it was gone. The last time I'd seen it was in the lodge, and now it was as if it had vanished completely. I tried to brush it off as something I'd misplaced, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a coincidence. The next morning, I logged into my laptop and went online, determined to put the entire experience behind me. I stayed away from the dark web, and instead spent hours scrolling through social media, watching mindless videos, and trying to fill my mind with anything but the lodge. But as I clicked through a news site, something caught my attention. It was a small article buried near the bottom of the page about an abandoned ski lodge in Colorado. The headline read, "Locals urge state to demolish long-abandoned mountain lodge." I clicked on it, my heart racing as I read the brief piece. It mentioned the lodge by name, a name I hadn't known until now, and described it as a site of local folklore, where strange sightings had been reported for decades. The article didn't go into detail, but it was enough to send a chill through me. The lodge hadn't just been abandoned, it had a history. I closed the tab and shut my laptop. I didn't want to know more. I didn't need to know more. Whatever had happened there, whatever I had experienced, was behind me now. I'd made it out. That was all that mattered. I still think about the lodge sometimes, usually late at night when the world is quiet and my mind starts to wander. I think about the warnings in the book, the giggling, the shadows. I think about the children, if that's even what they were, and the games they wanted to play. And sometimes I wonder if I left something behind there, or worse, if I brought something back with me. But then I remind myself of the one thing I'm certain of. I'll never go back. I've always been the kind of guy who gets a little too stuck in the past. Maybe it's nostalgia, or maybe it's the sheer mystery of some of the things I've experienced, but certain events just stick with you. This story starts with one of those events, or more specifically, a person. His name was Daniel. We went to high school together, and while we weren't super close, he was one of those people who was impossible to forget. Quiet, smart, but with this odd sense of humor that popped up when you least expected it. He was the kind of guy who, on the surface, seemed like he had everything figured out. But there was always something a little off. Not in a bad way. Just enough to make you wonder what went on in his head when no one was around. Then one day during senior year, he disappeared. Completely. No goodbyes, no dramatic exit. He was just gone. I remember sitting in math class when the teacher casually mentioned that Daniel had moved away, but no one seemed to know where or why. Even the teachers didn't have details, which was strange. It wasn't like he was the most popular guy in school, but people noticed. I noticed. I didn't think much of it at the time. People move all the time, right? But in the years since, it became this itch I couldn't scratch. It was like an unfinished chapter of my life, and I hated not knowing how the story ended. Fast forward to a couple of months ago. I'm now in my late 20s, working a boring desk job and spending way too much time online. One night, I was scrolling through Reddit, r/unresolved mysteries specifically, when I came across a thread about missing persons cases. People were sharing stories about friends and family members who had vanished, some of them decades ago. That's when Daniel popped into my mind again. For the first time in years, I felt that nagging itch. What really happened to him? Did he just move away? Did something darker happen? And why didn't anyone seem to care back then? The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. So I did what any self-respecting adult does when they're procrastinating. I Googled him. I looked up his name, his family, even random stuff like his old address. Nothing. It was like he had been wiped off the face of the earth. No social media profiles, no mentions in obituaries or public records. It was weird. That's when I started diving into darker corners of the internet. I'd heard about the dark web before, mostly in horror stories and sketchy YouTube videos, but I'd never thought about actually using it. I mean, why would I? I'm not exactly the hacking or drug buying type, but now it seemed like the only option. If regular Google couldn't help me, maybe the deep web could. Setting it up wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. I downloaded the Tor browser, watched a few tutorials on YouTube on incognito mode because I was already paranoid, and learned about .onion links. DuckDuckGo became my new best friend. Honestly, the whole process was kind of exciting at first. It felt like I was stepping into a hidden world, like the digital version of entering a forbidden library. But that excitement quickly faded when I realized how overwhelming it all was. Most of the sites were either scams, dead links, or stuff I didn't even want to understand. After a few nights of aimless clicking, I stumbled across a forum that seemed more legitimate. It was a place where people hired hackers for all kinds of things, recovering lost data, unlocking phones, even digging up dirt on cheating spouses. It was sketchy as hell, but it felt like my best shot. I created an account, making sure to use a VPN and a fake email, and posted a request, looking for someone to track down an old classmate. Need information about whereabouts, history, anything you can find. I didn't expect a response. Honestly, I wasn't even sure what I was doing at that point. It felt like a long shot, but at least I was doing something. I logged off and went to bed, telling myself I'd check back in the morning. What could possibly happen overnight, right? When I logged back in the next day, I had 3 messages waiting for me. 2 were obvious scams. One guy asked for $500 up front in Bitcoin, and the other sent me a link that probably would have fried my laptop if I'd clicked it. But the third message was different. It was short, professional, and strangely specific. I can find what you're looking for. Price depends on the complexity of the job. Send me any details you have and I'll give you a quote. The username was just a random string of letters and numbers, nothing identifiable. I hesitated for a while, but eventually I replied. I told him everything I remembered about Daniel, his full name, the school we went to, the year he disappeared. I even mentioned some of the rumors that floated around at the time. Stuff like his family being involved in shady business or him running away because of personal issues. I didn't think most of it was true, but I figured any detail might help. The reply came a few hours later. $200 in Bitcoin. You'll have results in 48 hours. It felt surreal. I'd never used cryptocurrency before, so I had to spend another few hours figuring out how to buy Bitcoin without getting scammed. Eventually, I managed to send the payment, and then I waited. Those 48 hours were some of the longest of my life. I kept checking my inbox obsessively, refreshing the page every few minutes like some kind of addict. When the time finally came, I logged in to find a single message waiting for me. Check the attached file. The file was a compressed folder, password protected. The password was in the message, and the folder's name was just Daniel Redacted. My heart was pounding as I downloaded it and opened the contents. Inside were dozens of documents. Some were PDFs, others were images, and there was even a text file that seemed to be a summary. But here's the thing. It wasn't just about Daniel. It was about me. My name was in there, along with details about my life that no one should have known. My childhood, my family, even stuff I'd only ever written in private journals. At first I thought it was some kind of mistake, but the more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about tracking down an old classmate. Somehow, I'd stumbled onto something much, much bigger. And that's when I saw the timeline. When I opened that timeline file, I wasn't sure what I was looking at first. It was neatly formatted, almost like something you'd see in an old-fashioned Word document, complete with bullet points and dates. The header read, Life Events, John Parker. And I had to double-check to make sure I wasn't imagining things. But no, it was all there. Everything. Every major moment in my life, listed in chronological order. The first entry was simple enough. Born, Mercy General Hospital, Denver, Colorado, August 17, 1994. Nothing too alarming there, the kind of thing you could probably dig up with some basic research. But the next few entries got weird. They weren't just major life events like graduations or moving houses. They included things that no one could have possibly known, at least no one outside of my immediate family. there was one that said, "Lost first tooth, July 13th, 2001, backyard trampoline accident." I remember that vividly. I'd been jumping on the trampoline with my cousin when I fell face first into the safety net. It wasn't exactly a moment I'd written down anywhere or talked about often. Who would even care about something so random? Another entry read, "First crush, Emily Sanders, 3rd grade, wrote anonymous Valentine's card." I froze when I saw that one. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was accurate. I'd never told anyone about that card. Not my friends, not even Emily herself. I'd crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash before I could lose my nerve, and I was sure no one had seen me do it. I kept scrolling, and the entries kept coming. It wasn't just the big stuff like where I went to college, University of Colorado, Boulder, or the date of my first job, June 2016, junior analyst at a local accounting firm. It was the small, insignificant details that hit the hardest. Things like the time I lied to my mom about breaking her vase in middle school. Sorry, Mom. Or the time I stayed up all night playing The Sims 2 in 2009 when I was supposed to be studying for finals. These weren't things you'd find in public records or even on social media. They were private moments, things only I should have known. The timeline didn't stop there, though. After listing everything up until the present day, it kept going. That's when I realized these weren't just entries about my past. They were predictions. Entries about my future. The first future event was only a day away. It read, "Coffee spill on work laptop, March 22nd, 2024. I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out how anyone could possibly know something so specific. It wasn't like I had a habit of spilling things. My desk at work was neat, and I always kept my coffee at a safe distance. There was no reason for something like that to happen, unless the file was somehow right. The next few entries were more mundane. Things like, "Buy milk, forget eggs, March 23rd, 2024, or "Traffic jam on way to downtown Denver, late to meeting, March 25th, 2024. It wasn't until I got to the last entry that I felt my stomach flip. It read, "Final entry, March 28th, 2024, 11:47 p.m. That was it. No explanation, no details, just a date and time, and the date wasn't far off. It was just a few days from now. At this point, my brain was doing mental gymnastics trying to figure out what was happening. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? Maybe someone had hacked into my devices, pieced together all this information, and was now messing with me for their own amusement. But even that didn't explain the private details, let alone the predictions. And who would even go to this much trouble? It wasn't like I was some big-shot celebrity or public figure. I was just a regular guy who'd made a bad decision by hiring a hacker. I tried to think rationally. Maybe it wasn't about me. Maybe this was just some kind of template they'd created to scare people into thinking they were being watched. But no, the details were too specific. There was no way this could have been random. I decided to test it. I looked at the timeline again, specifically at the next predicted event. Coffee spill on work laptop, March 22nd, 2024. I told myself I'd be extra careful the next day. No coffee near my laptop, period. If I could stop it from happening, maybe I could prove this whole thing was fake. Maybe I could convince myself that I'd just fallen for some elaborate hoax. The next day, I followed through on my plan. I didn't bring coffee to my desk at all. In fact, I didn't even drink coffee that morning. I switched to water just to be extra safe. Everything was going fine until around 11:30 a.m., when my coworker Sarah stopped by my desk. She had a cup of coffee in her hand, and as she leaned over to show me something on my screen, the inevitable happened. Her elbow bumped the cup, and the coffee spilled all over my laptop. It wasn't my fault. I hadn't even touched the coffee. But it didn't matter. The prediction had come true, just like the timeline said it would. By now, I was officially freaked out. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to that file. The last entry, the one with the date and time, loomed over me like a countdown clock. What was supposed to happen at 11:47 p.m. on that day? Was it my end or something else entirely? That night, I tried to distract myself by watching Netflix, scrolling through Instagram, and even playing some old video games. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed answers. The timeline wasn't going away, and ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. I decided to message the hacker again. Maybe they could tell me where they got the information or how they put the file together. So I logged back into the forum, only to find that their account was gone. Deleted. No trace of the messages we'd exchanged, no way to contact them. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. With nowhere else to turn, I did the only thing I could think of. I opened the file again. This time I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small, blinking cursor at the bottom of the last page, as if it were waiting for me to type something. I stared at the blinking cursor at the bottom of the file for what felt like forever. It was just sitting there, waiting, like the digital equivalent of someone tapping their fingers impatiently on a desk. My hands hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to type anything at first. I mean, what was I even supposed to say? Was this some kind of interactive program? A trap? A cruel joke? Finally, I decided on something simple. Who are you? I hit enter, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, a new line of text appeared. You already know. Chills, not the cliché kind, but the real unnerving kind, ran through me. I typed again. How do you know all of this about me? The reply came almost instantly. It's not about knowing. It's about observing. I was starting to feel like I was in some kind of philosophical debate, which wasn't exactly helping my already frayed nerves. I tried to keep my questions as straightforward as possible. Are you the hacker I hired? Yes and no. What kind of answer was that? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen as if it would somehow explain itself. The cursor blinked again, and another line of text appeared before I could type anything else. You shouldn't have come looking for Daniel. That threw me off completely. Up until this point, I'd almost forgotten why I'd started this whole mess in the first place. Daniel, my old classmate. The reason I'd even ventured onto the dark web to begin with. It felt like a lifetime ago, but now it was all rushing back. The file wasn't about him, it was about me. So why was this thing, program, person, whatever it was, bringing him up now? I typed quickly. What happened to him? Where is he? The response was longer this time. Daniel was the first, you're the second. The rest will follow. I stared at the screen, my mind racing through 100 different possibilities. The first? The first what? And what did it mean by the rest will follow? None of it made any sense. First what? I typed. This time there was no immediate response. The cursor blinked on and off, as if it were thinking, or maybe taunting me. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the reply came. The first to see. That didn't help much. I fired back. See what? The screen flickered. Just for a second, but enough to make my heart skip. When it stabilized, the file had changed. The timeline was gone, replaced by a single line of text in bold. The inevitable. I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. I wasn't getting anywhere with this back and forth, and the cryptic responses were only making things worse. I needed a different approach. Something more direct. What happens on March 28th at 11:47 p.m.? For the first time, there was no reply. The cursor just blinked, mocking me with its silence. I waited for what felt like minutes, my frustration growing with every passing second, but the screen stayed stubbornly blank. Finally, I closed the file. Whatever this was, it clearly wasn't going to give me a straight answer. But I wasn't ready to give up just yet. I decided to take a different route. If the hacker's account was gone and the file wasn't cooperating, Maybe I could figure out what happened to Daniel on my own. After all, this whole mess had started with him, hadn't it? I opened my browser and started digging. I went back to the school's old Facebook page, looking for alumni groups or reunion announcements. I searched his name in every database I could think of, from local news archives to online directories. I even checked old high school yearbooks that had been scanned and uploaded by some overzealous classmate. Nothing. But then I remembered something. Daniel used to be obsessed with online gaming. He was always talking about forums, multiplayer servers, and modding communities back in high school. It was one of the few things I knew he was genuinely passionate about. If he was still alive, maybe that's where I'd find him. It took hours, but I finally stumbled across an old post on a long-abandoned gaming forum. The username was familiar, Shadow Nebula, the same one Daniel had used for everything back in the day. The post itself wasn't anything special, just a comment on a thread about modding some obscure PC game, but the timestamp caught my attention. It was from late 2010, about a year after he disappeared. That didn't make sense. If Daniel had truly vanished, why was he posting online? And why hadn't anyone else found this? I clicked on the profile, hoping for more clues, but it was empty. No posts, no bio, no activity since that single comment. It was like he'd surfaced just long enough to leave a digital breadcrumb before disappearing again. I copied the username and started searching other platforms, just in case. After a lot of dead ends, I found something on an old subreddit dedicated to conspiracy theories. The post was buried deep from years ago, but it was definitely him. The username matched, and the writing style was exactly how I remembered it. Dry, sarcastic, and just a little too smart for its own good. The post itself wasn't long, but it sent shivers through me. They're watching everything. I'm not the first, and I won't be the last. If you find this, stop digging. It's not worth it. I leaned back in my chair, my mind reeling. Daniel was alive, or at least he had been alive when he wrote that post. But what did he mean by they? And why was he warning people to stop digging? I had more questions than answers, and I was no closer to figuring out what was going to happen on March 28th at 11:47 p.m. But one thing was clear. Whatever Daniel had gotten himself into, I was now tangled up in it too. After finding Daniel's post, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. If he had posted that message, it meant he was alive, at least at the time he wrote it. But the cryptic warning stayed with me. Stop digging. It's not worth it. It was like he'd written it directly to me, even though I knew that couldn't be true. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now in the middle of something much bigger than just tracking down an old classmate. I spent the next few hours searching the subreddit for more posts under Daniel's username, hoping to piece together the breadcrumbs he'd left behind. Most of the threads were standard conspiracy fare, stuff about surveillance, secret government programs, and digital footprints. But then I came across one that stopped me cold. It was titled, "The Algorithm is Watching." The post was short, just a couple of sentences, but it sent a chill through me. Everything you do online is recorded, tracked, and analyzed. They don't need to follow you. They already know you better than you know yourself. There's no escaping it, so stop looking before it's too late. It sounded like typical paranoid internet rambling, but after everything I'd seen in the timeline file, it felt uncomfortably real. The idea that someone, or something, could predict my every move wasn't just unsettling. It was downright terrifying. And yet, I couldn't stop. If Daniel had been trying to warn people, then maybe there was a way to find him and figure out what was really going on. I decided to dig deeper into the concept of the algorithm he mentioned. Late into the night, I found myself scrolling through obscure tech blogs and academic papers about machine learning, data mining, and artificial intelligence. Most of it was way over my head, but one article stood out. It described something called predictive behavioral algorithms, programs designed to analyze massive amounts of data and make eerily accurate predictions about human behavior. The idea was that by tracking things like social media activity, purchase history, and even search engine queries, these algorithms could anticipate what you'd do next with surprising precision. One example in the article hit a little too close to home. It described a case where a retail company had used predictive algorithms to send targeted ads to a teenage girl, ads for baby products. Turns out the algorithm had figured out she was pregnant before she'd even told her parents. The sheer level of detail these systems could extract from seemingly mundane activities was mind-blowing. Suddenly, the timeline file didn't seem so impossible anymore. If an algorithm could predict something as personal as a pregnancy, who's to say it couldn't predict my coffee spill or my forgotten eggs? But that still didn't explain how someone had access to this level of data about me, or why they'd go through the trouble of sending it to me in the first place. As I sat there trying to wrap my head around it all, I realized I hadn't checked the blinking cursor in the file since the day before. Maybe it had more to tell me. I opened the file again, half expecting it to be empty or corrupted, but it was still there. The timeline, the cryptic messages, it hadn't changed. And at the bottom of the page, the cursor was still blinking, as if waiting for me to continue the conversation. This time I didn't ask a question. I made a demand. Tell me what happened to Daniel. The reply was immediate. Daniel is where you will be. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Where is that? Everywhere and nowhere. There is no escape from the inevitable. The word inevitable again. It was starting to feel like whoever or whatever was behind this was playing some kind of twisted game. But I wasn't about to back down. What do you want from me? I typed. The cursor blinked for a moment before the reply appeared. To see. It was the same phrase as before. The first to see. I typed again, my frustration bubbling to the surface. To see what? The file closed itself. No warning, no explanation. Just gone. I tried reopening it, but it wouldn't load. It was like it had vanished from my hard drive entirely. I even checked my downloads folder, my recycle bin, everywhere I could think of. Nothing. I sat there in silence, staring at my now empty desktop. The timeline file had been my only lead, and now it was gone. But the date at the end, March 28th, 11:47 p.m., was still burned into my memory. That was only a few days away, and I had no idea what was supposed to happen. All I knew was that Daniel had been warning me to stop digging, and I hadn't listened. The next day, I decided to step away from my computer for a while. Maybe I'd been overthinking everything. Maybe this was all just some elaborate prank or a random glitch in the system, but even as I tried to convince myself of that, I couldn't shake the feeling that the timeline had been too specific to be fake. The coffee spill, the forgotten eggs, everything had lined up exactly as predicted. As the hours passed, I found myself going back to the question that had haunted me from the start. Why me? Out of all the people in the world, why had someone, or something, decided to send me this file? And what was I supposed to do with it? That night, I logged back onto the dark web forum, hoping to find some kind of clue or explanation. But the site was completely down. The URL wouldn't load, and even searching for it on DuckDuckGo brought up nothing but broken links. It was like the entire forum had been wiped off the face of the internet. Feeling stuck, I decided to revisit the gaming forum where I'd found Daniel's old post. Maybe there was something I'd missed, a hidden message, a link, anything. I scrolled through the thread again, reading every comment carefully. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the replies to Daniel's post had a timestamp that didn't match the rest of the thread. It was dated March 28th, 2024, 11:48 p.m. That couldn't be right. The post was years old, and the date in the reply hadn't even happened yet. It was like the message was waiting for something, or someone, to trigger it. But how could that be possible? I clicked on the reply, my heart pounding as the page loaded. The message was just one word. Ready? Hi, my name is Michael Parker. I'm John's younger brother, and I'm writing this because I don't know how else to process what's happened. A part of me hopes that by posting this here, someone, anyone, might understand what went wrong and give me answers. Because I don't have any. John passed away on March 28, 2024, at exactly 11:47 p.m. The details around his death are strange, to say the least. The official report says it was a heart attack. No foul play, no suspicious circumstances, just one of those rare, unexplainable things that happen sometimes, even to people who seem perfectly healthy. That's what the coroner told me anyway. But there's something about it that doesn't sit right with me, and I think it has everything to do with what he was working on before it happened. You see, John wasn't the kind of guy to get caught up in conspiracies or weird internet rabbit holes. Sure, he liked his share of tech stuff and spent too much time online, but he was always grounded in reality. That's why it felt so out of character when he started acting different. A few weeks before he died, he told me he was trying to track down an old classmate, someone named Daniel. He didn't say much about why, just that he was curious about what had happened to him. At first, I thought it was just nostalgia or boredom, but then John started spending hours locked away in his room, glued to his laptop. I asked him what he was doing, but he always brushed me off with a vague answer, like just researching or looking something up. Then about a week before it happened, he told me about the dark web. He mentioned hiring someone, a hacker I think, to help him find Daniel. That's when things really started getting weird. John seemed distracted, like he was always half listening when I talked to him. He started double-checking his phone, pacing the room and scribbling notes in a journal he kept on his desk. I figured he was just stressed from work or something, so I didn't push it. The last time we spoke was the night of March 28th. I remember it so clearly because he seemed more like himself for a moment. We were sitting in the living room, eating takeout from the Thai place down the street, and he said something that still haunts me. "You ever think about how much we give away online?" he asked, almost casually. "What do you mean?" I said. He shrugged, picking at his food. "Like, everything we do, our searches, our texts, even our habits, it's all out there somewhere and someone could piece it together if they wanted to." I didn't think much of it at the time. Yeah, I guess. But who would care enough to do that? He gave me this strange look, half amused, half serious, and said, "You'd be surprised. That was it." We finished eating and he went back to his room. I stayed up watching TV for a while, but when I went to check on him later that night, the door was locked. I figured he'd fallen asleep, so I left him alone. The next morning, I found him. I won't go into details because it's not something I want to relive, but suffice it to say he was gone. His laptop was still open on his desk and the screen was dark, but when I moved the mouse, it woke up. There was just one thing on the screen, a folder titled Timeline. I almost didn't open it. A part of me felt like it wasn't my place, like this was something private that John had been dealing with on his own. But curiosity won out, and when I clicked on it, I felt my stomach drop. It was exactly what he must have described to you earlier in this post. A timeline of his entire life, from the day he was born to the moment he died. Every detail was there, things only he, or maybe our family, could have known. And then there were the predictions. They were so specific, so accurate, it made my skin crawl. One of the final entries read, "Final, March 28th, 2024, 11:47 p.m. I thought it might have been a joke, some weird hoax, but the accuracy of the earlier predictions made that impossible. I don't know who or what made this file, but it knew things that no one should have been able to know. The worst part? After John's entry, the timeline didn't stop. There was another name, Michael Parker, followed by a list of events. My events. The first entry was something mundane. Forget wallet at coffee shop, March 29th, 2024. And guess what? I did. This morning. I left it on the counter at Starbucks and had to run back to grab it. It was exactly as the file said. I don't know what to do. I haven't told anyone about this. Not the police, not our parents, no one. But I'm terrified. If the timeline keeps going, does that mean it ends for me too? Is there some kind of countdown happening just like there was for John? The file is still on John's laptop. I haven't opened it since this morning, but the blinking cursor is still there, waiting for me to type something. I don't know what it wants, and I'm afraid to find out. But I feel like I'm running out of time. If anyone reading this knows what's happening, if you've seen anything like this before, please tell me what to do. I don't want to end up like John. That's all I know. The rest is up to you, whoever you are. Maybe this post will be ignored, buried under the endless threads of Reddit. Or maybe someone out there will understand. Either way, I'm leaving John's laptop in a safe place and stepping away from this for now. Because if the timeline is right, my final entry might be coming sooner than I'd like.